Dr. Laurel Leff is a professor of journalism and the Associate Director of Jewish Studies at Northeastern University in Boston. Her latest book, Well Worth Saving: American University's Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe, was a finalist for the 2020 National Jewish Book Award. Her previous book is Buried by the Times: The Holocaust in America's Most Important Newspaper. Dr. Leff has a master's in the study of law from Yale University and a master's in communication from the University of Miami. She received an AB from Princeton University. She was formerly a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Miami Herald, and an editor with American Lawyer Media and the Hartford Courant. It is my distinct honor and privilege to present Dr. Laurel Leff.
So again, the most important thing is, can you hear me? Oops, that moved when I didn't want it to. Okay, louder? Okay, I'll try and talk louder. I'm really happy to see you all. In addition to this being the first time they've had a big event at the library since COVID, this is the first time I've been speaking to a live audience since COVID, so I hope I'm not too rusty. It's really nice to be back in South Florida. If you might have figured out from my short bio there, we lived here a while ago and in Miami, and I went to the University of Miami for my master's in communications, and I was a reporter at the Miami Herald, so that makes it very nice to be here. In addition, my favorite cousin, Ellen Lipsman, lives in Palm Beach Gardens with her husband Saul, so they were able to come today, which also makes it really special for me. Is everybody hearing okay? I just want to confirm that again. Okay. So as you see there, I'm going to be talking about the New York Times' Nazi correspondent. And we're going to start during the First World War. The alert German government allowed just one American correspondent to remain in Germany. It was this guy, Guido Enderis of the Associated Press. Enderis was interned. I'm going to be doing a lot of scare quotes, so I'm just kind of call your attention to that, because sometimes I think it's very important to hear the actual language that was used. But Enderis was interned not in some drafty barracks in the hinterlands, but in the sumptuous Hotel Adlon. Here's the Hotel Adlon, the meeting place of Berlin's elite, across from the Brandenburg Gate. Enderis could roam freely during the day, as long as he returned to the Adlon at night. The gossipy Berlin press corps took this as a sign that Enderis' sympathies lay with his German hosts. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Enderis was still living in the Adlon. His employer had changed. He was now the New York Times' Berlin bureau chief. The government had changed. Nazis now controlled the country. But Enderis' loyalties to Germany hadn't. He was known to sit in the Adlon bar, and here's the bar, spouting a loud-mouthed defense of Nazism, eventually provoking another reporter to complain to the Times publisher. Isn't it about time that the New York Times did something about its Nazi correspondent? But the Times had no intention of doing anything about Enderis. In fact, it valued his close connections to the Nazi government. All American newspapers found reporting in Nazi Germany difficult. The government tightly controlled information and harangued and threatened reporters who managed to publish what it didn't like. The Nazi regime also didn't hesitate to use its strongest weapons, banning a newspaper from distribution in Germany, kicking a reporter out of the country, or denying a reporter's re-entry. As a Jewish-owned newspaper, the New York Times had been owned by a Jewish family since 1896, the New York Times considered itself a special target. Bureau Chief Enderis' job, therefore, was administering reasonably smoothing syrup to Nazi officials, as another Times reporter put it. Yet Enderis' actions weren't purely strategic, and their consequences were grave. Throughout the 1930s, Andarus helped steer Times coverage to play down Jewish persecution and play up Germany's peaceful intentions. He kowtowed to Nazi officials, wrote stories presenting solely the Nazi point of view, and reined in Times reporters whose criticism he thought went too far. Other New York Times reporters, most conspicuously Walter Duranty, who minimized the Soviet famine that took millions of Ukrainian lives in the 1920s, have become notorious once time has passed and archives have opened. Andarus, however, has remained largely under the radar. I wrote about him in my 2005 book, Buried by the Times, and here's the cover, The Holocaust in America's Most Important Newspaper. But Andarus's personal perfidy likely got lost in the greater transgressions of his employer. But now, in our politically charged moment, he's been resurrected to exemplify the Times' supposed original sin of constructing biased narratives to fit preconceived corporate agendas. Except, and I think this is important, the Times had no agenda to bolster Nazism. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, the Times publisher during most of the Nazi era, detested Hitler and advocated U.S. intervention to stop German aggression. And that wasn't true of all Americans during this time period. That's Arthur Sulzberger. Nor was Andarus a Nazi collaborator, a charge that should be leveled carefully given that Nazi propaganda services actually enlisted American correspondents and paid them to present certain kinds of news. Andarus was not in that position. Instead, what crippled the Times at conception was a timidity and a deference to authority born of being an institution controlled by Jews who desperately wanted to fit into WASP American society. Rather than run the slightest risk of being tossed out of Nazi Germany and thus causing a ruckus over its Jewish ownership, the Times let a Uriah Heep-like figure, and I couldn't but avoid that metaphor once I saw what he looked like, lead its Berlin bureau during its most consequential decade. So Andarus grew up in Milwaukee. His father worked for two separate German language newspapers. Andarus acquired an affinity for Germany. A German language newspaper sent the younger Andarus to Berlin in 1916. The following year, so this was during World War I, the following year, Andarus joined the Associated Press wire service in Berlin. A decade later, the New York Times hired him for its Berlin bureau, naming him bureau chief in 1930. Andarus was 56 and known for wearing loud suits and bright red ties. Here is the Times bureau that year when its publisher Adolf Ochs, the son of Jewish immigrants from Germany, visited. And you can see here, I'm not sure I can do this right, but you'll see to the far left, that's Andarus kind of crunched over like that. Sitting next to him is Adolf Ochs, the New York Times publisher, and then two over from that is Edwin James, who was the managing editor of the New York Times. From the beginning, Andarus's journalistic deficiencies were apparent. Andarus had, and here I'm quoting from some of his editors, a ponderous, wordy style that is often so vague that we have to change his dispatches to let the reader know what he means, wrote one editor. Andarus's reporting was no better. He was too credulous, whether the results of intention or ineptitude, to be a good journalist. In 1932, Frederick Birchall, and I'll take a look at Frederick, here he is, the Times' acting managing editor, who had just assumed a new position as chief foreign correspondent, visited Berlin and reported back to the publisher-in-waiting, Sulzberger. The bureau's problem lay with its chief, Birchall concluded, but Birchall didn't recommend replacing Andarus, an excellent office manager, who had brought expenses down considerably. Instead, Birchall suggested putting a younger, more enterprising and picturesque man in just below him, which is what the Times did in early 1933, hiring 43-year-old Otto Tolushus, a German-born, American-bred wire service reporter, to be one of the correspondents there. I don't know exactly how picturesque the guy is, but that was what the Birchall had said. And then Birchall, who again was the chief roving correspondent, would pop in from time to time. And had the news flow been anything like that of a normal foreign capital, this might have been a harmless arrangement. But on January 30th, 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and Berlin became the center of the news universe. Hitler quickly disabled the legislature, opened concentration camps, booted Jews from government and university positions, and took over the domestic press, along with all other forms of media. And that was just in his first year. I think one of the things people forget about Hitler is how quickly he moved to consolidate power. So by the time you got to the end of 1933, he was in complete control of the government. I should also say that all of the things that I just mentioned were things that the German government announced. These were not secrets. This was, this was their policy that they put forward to anybody who was listening and paying attention. Rather than figuring out how best to cover these momentous events, Andaris began plotting how best to get in good with the new regime. The Times' worldwide photo subsidiary, a photo distribution service that was incorporated in Germany, and the incorporated in Germany part of it is important, provided an opportunity. And just to give you an idea of the kind of work Worldwide Photo did, they were a bunch of photographers who would take photos of what was happening in Germany and then offer it up as part of a distribution service to anybody who was interested and would pay for their photos. And here's just one example. This is Germans, ordinary Germans, saluting, doing the Heil Hitler, and this was taken in 1935. In July 1933, Andaris advised changing the service's name, Worldwide Photo's name, to, in scare quotes, to some nice Germanic form, and firing its manager, Julius Bulgar, who, and again these are Andaris's words, is of Jewish origin and moreover has been himself in dealing with Nazi protests in a highly independent spirit. And Andaris wrote that to Birchall. Alarmed, Birchall devised against, and this is what he wrote back, yielding to the pressure of these miserable fanatics, and tried to persuade Andaris, again quoting Birchall, with such emphasis as the good Lord would give to me. But Andaris insisted his recommendations, and again, this was to get a new, more Germanic-sounding name and to fire the Jewish manager of Worldwide Photos, insisted that these recommendations be passed on to top management. Both publisher Adolf Ochs, who was still nominally in charge, he actually died in 1935, and then it was passed on to his son-in-law, Arthur Sulzberger. But at this point in 1933, both Ochs and Sulzberger sided with Birchall and wouldn't change the name or fire all of the Jewish photographers, at least at that point. Sulzberger shot back to Andaris. I'm sorry if this is, or to Birchall, to give to Andaris. I'm sorry if this is disturbing to Mr. Andaris, but what in the name of heaven does he think a jaw is for, except to set it firmly when the occasion demands? The Times' jaw, however, soon proved a bit wobbly. Over the next 2 years, the Times allowed a Nazi shop sale to form in its subsidiary, didn't stop a swastika flag from being flown on the building that housed the Berlin Bureau. And here you can see, it may be a little hard to see the words, but in big gold letters it says the New York Times, and then you can see in the upper left-hand corner the Nazi swastika flag flying over it. Permitted its German employees to march in a May Day celebration of Hitler, and probably most significantly, fired all its Jewish photographers from Worldwide Photo. When a scheme to hire Aryan Camouflages, which probably needs a little bit of explanation, what the Times decided to do was to keep the Jewish photographers, including Julius Bulgar, the manager, and pay them, be on their staff, but they would continue to do the work. But each one of them, amazingly enough, had an Aryan who was his camouflage, who would be, when the Gestapo's made inquiries or looked at the books, would be the person who was supposedly employed. So they tried that gambit for a while. It didn't work. It's a pretty crazy idea. And the Times then did close Worldwide Photo. Andaris's meddling wasn't reserved to the business side. And again, this is quoting actually from Birchall. "Scarcely an item has gone to the New York Times that he did not inspire, supervise, and frequently edit," he wrote in April 1934. So what was Enderis writing himself during this period? So he's both supervising the staff and he's also doing his own writing. Well, he produced puffy profiles of leading Nazis, including Joseph Goebbels. Oops, that's not Joseph Goebbels. That's Edwin James, the managing editor. That's Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels, for some reason, was a favorite of Enderis, so he wrote about him as the head of the Reich newly created Ministry of Propaganda and Popular Enlightenment. He described him as the outstanding go-getter of his party. He later also wrote that Goebbels is, and now I'm quoting from a story that appeared in the New York Times, "a voluble but versatile master of Nazi ballyhoo with a gift of rhetoric." And he was describing a speech that Goebbels gave exalting the Jewish banishment from the film industry. But the way he described it was a person with a gift of rhetoric. Enderis wrote lighthearted stories about bachelors, including Hitler pushing a Nazi campaign for bigger families, or about Hitler's 50th birthday celebration that turned Berlin into, and again this is in quotes, all motion, color, and noise. The biggest failing of Enderis's reporting early on, and that actually of Birchall too, was reading into every move a Nazi drive toward moderation. Enderis's articles assured, and these are headlines from actual New York Times stories, Hitler threatening Nazi radicals, government accepting counsel from moderate quarter, Hitler puts curb on zealous Nazis. So the thought was, and this is the way they described Hitler, that he was sort of, could be pressured either by the more extremists or he himself was more moderate, and it was a question of which of those impulses was going to take prominence. It's pretty clear what did. The New York Times did not keep pushing that line. But, and I think this is the biggest failing of Enderis's reporting throughout the Nazi era, was to offer up, without hesitation or qualification, Nazi refutations of criticisms of the regime. When there were, and this is from a Times story, charges abroad of atrocities in the country, Enderis reported that, and this is again quoting from a story that he wrote, the government would not tolerate persecution of the Jews and had established no discrimination against them. When the League of Nations warned that, and that was the group before the United Nations that represented international solidarity, warned that Germans were rearming in violation of the Versailles Treaty, Enderis considered the admonition, and this is again quoting from one of his stories, a pretext once more to pillory the Reich as the world's perennial villain. Enderis wrote again and again of Germany's peaceful intentions, despite its expansion into the Saar and Rhineland regions, its annexation of Austria, and takeover of Czechoslovakia. And I'm going to quote a story to you, and listen to this carefully. A peaceful, prosperous Europe was envisaged today by Chancellor Hitler in a speech before the Reichstag. That's the first line in the story. The tenor of the speech was self-assertive, yet free of aggressive emphasis, and it ended on a note that left full scope for diplomatic action or mediation. If the tone of the speech can be accepted as a gauge, Herr Hitler sincerely desires a peaceful solution of the conflict with Britain and France. Remarkably, Hitler delivered the speech, and Enderis wrote about it 5 weeks after Germany invaded Poland and ignited World War II. It's hard to know which took more chutzpah, for Hitler to say it, for Enderis to write it, or for the Times to publish it. And then there are the stories that Enderis didn't want to write, often about what was happening to the Jews. New York editors kept sending cabled queries, and you might know that during this time period, you wouldn't call and certainly send an email. Most of the communication between the New York office and the Berlin bureau was by cablegrams. So here's what the Times editors in New York would say. They wanted to know, how much money can Jews take out of Germany? Any truth Jews are segregated on all the railroad cards? Were Jews in Amsterdam being concentrated in one part of the city? What's with the new anti-Semitic decree in France? Are Jews in Germany no longer able to obtain exit visas? Andarus's reluctance to take on the regime's evils and his willingness, maybe even eagerness, to believe Nazi denials came together in one telling story. And there are many of these. I just can't give you examples of every single one. You have to kind of trust me that this exemplifies what his reporting and writing was like. But here's the story. This is, first he gets a note from managing editor Edwin James, and James says, as you know, we have been trying to get something on the concentration camps without much success. Replying, Andarus poo-pooed the camp's significance. He explained that he had interviewed a prisoner in the Oranienburg concentration camp, who I was able to find out was actually a a Jewish communist newspaper reporter, whose name was Werner Hirsch, who made, and after his interview, this is what he says to James in New York, the prisoner made a normal impression, gave no indication of maltreatment, and reported he had gained 8 pounds since arriving at the camp. Andarus's subsequent article, so that was what he said, in a cable back to James, but he also then wrote an article about it, and here you can see a little bit of the article. I'm sure you can't read it, but I'll kind of summarize it. Maybe you can at least see what the headline says. So it reflected that nothing to see here perspective. He assured that the number of political prisoners still had, and he described it as protective custody in Germany, had dropped precipitously to between 7,500 and 8,000, and that number is being rapidly reduced. And some concentration camps are, in fact, being liquidated, closed. As for the conditions of inmates still in the camps, inquiries of, this is what he wrote in this story, inquiries of this correspondent have brought the information that all are in good health, and any rumors of their being neglected might be discounted in advance. And I don't need to tell anyone in this room that that was a total crock. The conditions in the concentration camps which were not closed, this was, I think, 1935 was the story. They continued to have people imprisoned in concentration camps up until the very end of the war in 1945. Now, as an employee of a newspaper owned by Jews, Andarus wasn't likely to be above board about any anti-Semitic inclinations. But when a Jewish telegraphic agency reporter, and you might be familiar with the JTA, it's still in existence, it still provides wire service news, it offers it up to other newspapers on Jewish issues. So when a Jewish telegraphic agency reporter visited the Times Bureau, and apparently, at least according to the people at the Times, stirred up some trouble with the Gestapo, Andarus reported to editors in New York that the JTA reporter, whose name was Israel Levitan, was, and I'm quoting Andarus, an inquisitive, highly Semitic-looking person of the communistic intellectual type. Andarus advised the newspaper to disregard JTA stories entirely. He wanted them not to use the JTA at all. And this is what he wrote. They reach us over the open wire, embarrass us, I assume because they're indicating how the German government is treating the Jews, and provoke official irritations whenever we try to run them down. So he doesn't even want to be in the position of having to confirm these stories. The Times did, in fact, cancel its JTA subscription 3 years later, although for somewhat different reasons. Of course, Andarus wasn't the only Times correspondent covering Germany. Both Tolushus, who you might remember was the picturesque younger man put in below Andarus, and Frederick Birchall, the chief roving correspondent who kind of went in and out of the country, had better, if not perfect, records in holding the Nazi regime accountable. And that was by design. It was sort of a good cop, bad cop thing. The idea was that Birchall and Tolushus wrote more negative stories, and then Inderis stepped in to assuage any wounded sensibilities. And Birchall, in particular, who came and went frequently, needed the German government to sanction his return each time. So he depended on Inderis to clear his path with the government. And so one example of how that worked is right before the Olympics in Berlin in the summer of 1936. Birchall wanted to be able to come back in to cover the Olympics. The German government was making it difficult for him. So what Inderis suggested is he write some what we would now call puff pieces, things that were favorable to the government, as a way to get back into Germany, and then he would be able to cover the Olympics, and that's what happened. And as I didn't get to see enough of the the Holocaust exhibit out there, but I did notice that there was a piece about the 1936 Olympics and Jesse Owens' memorable gold medals in that Olympics. What this doesn't say, though, is that a lot of the press coverage was very favorable to the Nazi regime. That was part of the idea why Hitler wanted to do it. And I know there is some indication that Owens, by winning a gold medal as an African American, embarrassed Hitler. But overall, the American press coverage of those Olympics was very favorable and helpful to the Nazi government. So I just thought I'd throw that in. And so this was kind of the thing, what he did, particularly with Birchall, and with Tolushus too. They would write something critical. He would then go and apologize profusely to the Gestapo or the Foreign News Service, whoever was coming down on that reporter. But I think one of the things about Inderis, again, is that while this was done to sort of make sure the Times could keep its presence in Germany, be able to continue to report, he was as intent on keeping the Times from printing things that upset the government as he was on allowing the Times to keep printing. When the Times published a cartoon on its editorial page depicting Hitler in a way the Germans considered disrespectful, Inderis convinced the government not to ban the sale of the New York Times, which is what they were threatening. He then addressed what he considered the real affront, publishing the poisonous, as he described it, cartoon. He pointedly reminded the managing editor, and this I'm quoting him, of the traditional custom which leaves the head of a friendly government immune from lampooning of such malicious variety. Whatever the Times might believe, Inderis wrote, the Fuhrer, this is his quote, is in his triple capacity as head of the state, chief of the government, and leader of the party, the three-ply it. He capitalized all the letters in it. Most news organizations had to walk a fine line between reporting harsh realities and maintaining the ability to report it all. Many American correspondents were expelled. Many newspapers were banned temporarily. But it's clear other Berlin correspondents thought Inderis stepped over the line. So did some inside the Times. When managing editor James proposed in April 1938 that all Times reporters in authoritarian countries be given some leeway if their stories weren't always hard-hitting, Sunday editor Lester Markel agreed, with a caveat. And this is what Markel wrote. Why don't you so tell the boys, with the exception of Inderis, who has so many alibis now without the donation of an additional one? Once the war started in September 1939, even his Times supervisors grew concerned about Inderis' sympathies. 10 days after the Germans invaded Poland, Birchall felt obligated to cable the managing editor to apply screws, that was his language, to Inderis, who was automatically expressing the German position. And then Birchall added, if he can only send propaganda they want printed, why pay transmission fee? Either the screws weren't applied or they didn't work. The Times publishes Inderis' story about Herr Hitler's sincere desire for peace a month later, again, 5 weeks after the invasion of Poland. In April 1940, James killed an Inderis story on a German white paper that attacked Western powers and Norway. The managing editor told Salzburg the story was and I'm quoting, very, very pro-German, and cabled Enderes, try to be more objective. That spring, Enderes's role in the Bureau actually grew, and this is sort of just, in some ways, just bad luck. Birchall was a British citizen. He had never given up he was born in Great Britain, he never gave up his British citizenship. So when Germany and England went to war, he could no longer go to Germany, and the Times transferred him to Ottawa. So he was in Canada for the duration of the war. In March 1940, the German government informed Tolushus that his permit to remain in the country would not be renewed. And Enderes did try and get that reversed, but he wasn't able to. So Tolushus then followed the invading German army into Denmark and Norway, and the Times then transferred him to Japan, where he was interned right after Pearl Harbor, and he spent the war years in a Japanese prison. That left Enderes and two recently hired, relatively inexperienced reporters in the Berlin Bureau as Germany conquered most of Western Europe and began shipping Jews in the Reich and conquered countries to ghettos in Poland. The other two reporters were in their early 20s. They had had almost no experience. Now, for 7 years, Enderes's appeasement strategy with the Nazi government had been the subject of grumbling within the Times and among the Berlin press corps. In September 1939, it threatened to blow up into a full-scale scandal. While monitoring Nazi radio reports for the BBC, he was working for the BBC part-time, Warren Irvine, who was a former New York Times City Desk reporter and a part-time New York Times Geneva correspondent, noticed something unsettling. Nazi radio often quoted the New York Times, and Guido Enderes's byline appeared on many of those stories. Irvine then wrote Times publisher Sulzberger, imploring the newspaper to do something about its Nazi correspondent, and those were the words he used. If Sulzberger didn't, Irvine warned, he would. And this is what he wrote: "I don't want to do anything to hurt my own paper, but I feel that loyalty to my country comes first. And if some action is not taken, I shall feel compelled to publish these facts." Sulzberger, who received the letter, sort of didn't really know how to respond. He went to the managing editor, who acknowledged that Enderes had, in the managing editor's words, absorbed a certain amount of the German point of view. There was no ignorance in the office here concerning this circumstance. It is fully realized. But, the managing editor added, time after time, he was able to smooth out difficulties into which some of our correspondents got. As for Irvine's letter, James wasn't sure what had provoked it. He noted that Irvine and Enderes had gotten into a fight when Irvine was in Berlin in the Adlon bar, as you saw before. But James pleaded ignorance of the merits, except, and this is quoting him, Irvine drinks more than Enderes, who drinks very little. Still, James admitted there was something to Irvine's concern. "I realize that the inferences are all against Enderes," he wrote. "But if you fire him or withdraw him from Berlin, that will close our Berlin bureau. James's solution? Keep Enderes on, but have him write very little. The less we have from him, the better." I should point out, as a former newspaper editor and reporter, newspaper editors never tell their reporters not to write more stories. They always tell them to write more stories. But not in this particular case. And James also recommended threatening Irvine with a libel suit. Sulzberger took the advice, warning Irvine that if he published from him what you call facts, Sulzberger would sue for defamation. Irvine wrote back, and this is quoting him, "What I call facts are facts. Enderes has made no secret of his pro-Nazi sympathies." Irvine added, "I don't question the usefulness and value of Mr. Enderes to the New York Times. I do question the right of the greatest American newspaper to maintain a pro-Nazi as its chief correspondent in Berlin in times like these." Now, Irvine did not go public. It may be that he was really scared about a defamation suit, but he didn't go public. James, however, carried through on expecting Inderis to write very few stories and bragged about Inderis's lack of productivity. Now, this affected the Berlin Bureau. And again, these are absolutely critical years, right? This is 1940 and 1941. The absence of the experienced reporters, Birchall and Tolushus, and the silence of another senior reporter hurt the Berlin Bureau. The Times resorted to relying heavily upon the wire services. And this occasionally bothered James. In mid-November 1941, Propaganda Minister Goebbels laid out a 10-point charter for the Nazi campaign against the Jews. And again, this was in public, which the Times reported on page 11 from a United Press account. So this was a wire service account, not the actual Times reporting. And James actually criticized Inderis in a cable. UP 24 hours ahead of you on Jewish story. The story reported Goebbels' terrifying predictions, and this is what the words that were used in this story. Again, this is November 1941. In this historical showdown, every Jew is our enemy, regardless of whether he is vegetating in a Polish ghetto or delays his parasitic existence in Berlin or Hamburg or blows the war trumpets in New York and Washington. The current developments are fulfilling Adolf Hitler's prophecy on January 30th, 1939, that the Jews in Europe would be exterminated if international finance succeeds in hurling the nations into a world war. The New York Times Berlin Bureau was not there to cover the fulfillment of Hitler's prophecy. The next month, of course, it was the attack on Pearl Harbor. Germany declared war on the United States and rounded up all American correspondents in Berlin, with one exception. The New York Times reported in a brief item that Guido Inderis was the only American journalist not arrested and detained in a town that was 6 hours from Berlin. Inderis was again given the option of being interned in the Hotel Adlon. 3 days later, the Times published another short story seeming to correct its previous story. I think they got an enormous amount of flack for that. Guido Inderis of the New York Times, who was ill with bronchial troubles, has been allowed to remain under doctor's treatment at his hotel, the Adlon. Inderis ended up joining the Times' enlarged bureau in Bern, Switzerland. Once the war started, the Times, as did other American newspapers, covered it primarily from neutral countries, so from Sweden or from Switzerland. So it was the Bern Bureau, who I also write about very critically in my book, Buried by the Times, who then had responsibility for covering what was happening to the Jews in Europe, among many, many other stories. So Inderis was transferred there. He suffered a slight stroke. He rarely came into the office. The only time Inderis's name appeared in the New York Times in all of 1942 was when the American legation's secretary threw him a birthday party. At the end of the war, he picked up his pace, however, in 1943, publishing 11 byline stories, most based on articles in the German press that reflected the nation's gloom, that was his word, as victory slipped away. At the end of the war, James, the managing editor, worried about Inderis's sympathies as he had at the beginning. Disappointed and concerned about your Goebbels story yesternight, James cabled Inderis in October 1944 about an article suggesting Germany would be able to hold off the Allied advance. The war ended May 8, 1945. Inderis suffered a more serious stroke that year that left him paralyzed and unable to speak. He returned to Milwaukee, to which he had only made 7 visits in the previous 30 years. When he died the following year, the Milwaukee Journal carried a front-page obituary. Guido Inderis lived for his profession. The obit quoted his sister, Miss Dorothy C. Inderis. The New York Times, his professional home for 17 years, however, did not author its own obituary, acknowledging the death of its Berlin bureau chief only in it made do with a short syndicated wire piece that you see here. So that's the story of Guido Inderis, the Nazi correspondent for the New York Times. Thank you.